hello everybody. Welcome back to In the Loop. This is a podcast by Texas Guadalupe. We are the University of Texas's Hyperloop team. I am your co-host, Gavin Nader, and I am the head of business.
I'm your other co-host, David Spittler, and I'm the head of engineering for Texas Guadalupe.
So today we have Dr. Jah Moriba. Dr. Jah is an associate professor of aerospace engineering and engineering mechanics at the University of Texas, where he is the holder of the Mrs. Pearlie Dashiell Henderson Centennial Fellowship in Engineering. He is also the director for computational astronautical sciences and technologies, as well as the lead for the Space, Security, and Safety program at the Robert Strauss Center for National Security and Law. So if you were at like a party or you're just talking to someone who wasn't a space nerd, how would you sort of introduce yourself and describe what you do? Because I know that was kind of a mouthful.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I would probably say that I'm a space environmentalist. I want to protect the space environment as a resource, and I'm really into trying to understand how things move in space.
Okay, cool. So also today we're trying something new within the club. So we're live streaming this to our members. So they're going to be able to enter some questions into the chat. And then at the end,
we'll be able to,
we'll be able to ask them for them.
Cool.
And then I just want to start out by saying, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I'll let you folks moderate the questions or whatever.
Yeah, we'll pick and choose. But yeah, I want to start out by saying that in David and I's research, basically we found that you're trying to inject humanity into this topic and in what you do. And we think that that can be pretty rare in a field that's mostly all about hard achievements. So that's something that we really appreciate. And hopefully today we can ask you some questions that you're not so used to hearing.
I love that. Yeah.
But the first question is definitely one you've heard before. So do you mind just giving us some insight into your earlier years? What got you interested into space and sort of the main checkpoints along your journey to where you are now?
Yeah. So, when I graduated from high school, I joined the U.S. Air Force as an enlisted person. My job was I was a security policeman, so it was my job to guard nuclear missiles, specifically Minuteman II and Minuteman III systems at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. And I, even though I was born in the States, I moved to Venezuela when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I lived in Caracas. And Caracas is a thriving metropolis, lots of city lights, that sort of stuff. And when I went to Montana, I had never been in a place with skies so dark before. And so a lot of my shifts were night shifts, and I was in pretty much utter amazement at how many stars I could see at night and that sort of stuff. I'd never seen the Milky Way so crisp before, and these sorts of things. But interestingly enough, I noticed that there were some dots of light that would move across the sky, and sometimes the dots of light would actually disappear. I'm like, is this a UFO, extraterrestrials? What's going on here? And so I realized, look, these things, they're not planes. They're not meteors. So what could this stuff be? And by doing a little bit of research, I came to find out that these things are anthropogenic space objects, or human-made, human-derived objects orbiting the Earth. And the times that I saw these things disappearing is because they were entering Earth's shadow. And so it was wow, I was amazed. I'm with my naked eye, I can see objects that humans were responsible for in some way, shape, or fashion, orbiting the Earth, reflecting sunlight in my direction. And it's some of these things are getting eclipsed by the Earth itself, and I can see when that happens. I was wow, I want to know more about that. And so that's where the spark began.
Wow. So from there you went to Embry-Riddle, is that correct? And
yeah, so I went to Embry-Riddle. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I was just wondering sort of what really set you on that path to do aerospace engineering, and what role did Ron Madler play in your life? What did he look like as a mentor?
Yeah. So, yeah. Well, interestingly enough, one of my friends and mentors in the military, the late Donald Wallace, he was a nuclear missile maintenance crew chief, and I had talked to him about my experiences, watching dots across the sky. And he's like, look, man, when you finish your enlistment with the Air Force, you should study aerospace engineering to learn more about this stuff. And I had never even heard about aerospace engineering. And in fact, up until that point, I thought engineers were the ones that I saw in cartoons as a kid that had these overalls that were like black and white, and they were, in front of choo-choo trains and that sort of thing. So basically on that whim, I decided, okay, I'm going to study aerospace engineering. I ended up going to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona. Ron Madler had just kind of arrived on scene. I mean, he had been there, I think, maybe 1 or 2 semesters before I started, freshly minted PhD out of University of Colorado. And I don't know. I mean, I didn't think that the whole NASA thing was something for me. I thought, I'm not smart enough for that that's for other people. But Ron made it more real, made it more kind of attainable. And eventually I became a NASA space grant researcher under the Arizona Space Grant Program, and worked with Ron on some of these, astrodynamics problems.
Oh, so to break this up a little bit, you recently accepted a new mentee who was awarded the PGS Fellowship. Looking back on your mentors, were they a big reason that you want to continue mentoring different people? And what do you see as your role being a mentor?
I think that if you actually feel that what it is that you do is of societal impact, positive societal impact, then mentorship is a natural consequence, because clearly it's important enough for you to be pouring your life into. And given that we don't live forever, there's got to be, as they say in the medical community, continuity of care. And part of that continuity of care is making sure that other folks can, especially the ones that are hungry and really want to do it, because a lot of this is personality driven. You can't force people to do things that they don't want, really. So it's like, yeah, if you have folks that can step into these roles to continue the work, to progress it, to, surpass anything that you've done, then that's just, to me, a natural consequence. So when I see people that are supposedly doing really awesome stuff and they're not mentoring anybody, to me, that's a red flag about themselves.
Interesting. All right, so you then moved to the Air Force Research Lab in Maui. Is that the pictures I see on top of the mountains, the telescopes with the big sky in the background? Okay, wow.
Exactly.
So can you talk about what you researched there? And also, I know in past talks you've discussed that's when you saw the cultural impact of these two sort of societies colliding. Is that where that really started to click for you?
Yeah. So I, back in 2004, I went to Maui for a conference that was part of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. And I took my wife and my son with me, and it was love with the island, of course. Who wouldn't fall in love with tropical weather and, people with little clothing on playing conch shells at sunset and that sort of stuff. And so it was like, yeah, we want to live on Maui. Let's make that happen. JPL, thank you very much. Mars missions. Oh, that was really awesome. Now we need to shift to something different. And I found a way to get hired on Maui to support the Air Force Research Lab and its mission of trying to kind of discover, let's say, indications and warnings of threats on orbit. So the Department of Defense, US government, has assets in space. And back in 1957, when, launching Sputnik, there were very few countries that could actually get things to orbit. Now it's like 2006, when I moved to Maui, and there's over 20,000 things being tracked. And so, yeah, the government before could build school bus sized things to do all sorts of stuff. And when they looked around, they didn't see much. And then all of a sudden now they look around, they see lots of things. And so what could be posing a threat to, the kind of the loss, disruption, or degradation of any of those critical services and capabilities? And so it was my job as an astrodynamicist on Maui to look at the scientific and technological research that could underpin making good decisions and discovering kind of, where threats on orbit might reside, so that, proactive decision making could take place. And so that's when I became acquainted with the space garbage problem, realizing, wow, it's like out of more than 20,000 things being tracked, 96% of the stuff is garbage in one way or another. So there are very few things that are actually working and providing a service. And I was like, that doesn't seem right. That's pretty messed up. Why is all this trash like staying up there and all that? So that's when I started investigating that and juxtaposed that with being on Maui, living in a place that surprisingly huge disparity between natives and everybody else, and ecologically detrimental practices, the landfills, the hotel industry, maximizing single-use plastics. I was like, wow, I couldn't believe it. So all that kind of came together for me as seeds towards this idea of space environmentalism.
I'm glad you brought up space debris there. Could you kind of summarize a little bit what the general problem is for people who wouldn't understand that as much?
Yeah. So look, much like we have problems with plastics in the ocean and these sorts of things, and we have circulation of water around the planet, currents and that sort of stuff. Very similarly, we have kind of circulation of, let's call it, orbital currents. The space environment interacts with these objects in very specific ways. And we have very specific highways in space where we put these objects depending on what it is that we want them to do. So a lot of like Earth observation satellites are in this thing called sun synchronous orbit, which is very polluted with debris. High altitude, 900, 800 kilometer altitude kind of stuff. We have things in geosynchronous orbit, which it takes an object there about 24 hours to go around once in its orbit. So it's the kind of the Goldilocks place to put something so that for Earth communication, because it's the same rotation rate as the Earth sort of thing. So we have these very unique, Mother Nature has given us these unique orbital pathways. And most of the stuff that we put up there just doesn't come back because it's far above the sensible atmosphere. So it doesn't experience, this friction with atmospheric drag. So things are up there for perpetuity, by and large. And the thing is, it's very expensive to put things up there, which means it's really expensive to remove things. So the, modus operandi of space operations is, the thing failed, it stopped working, send up another, and that sort of thing. So that's the problem, is that when things die, with biology, when things die, they decompose and they don't exist anymore. In orbit, when things die, they stay there and they still exist. And now they're hazards to other things, and they don't slow down. They keep on moving at the same speed. So it's like you're driving on a highway, you run out of gas, you just get into another car, but the car that you were on that isn't really drivable anymore, it's just going at speed. And it's kind of following whatever path Mother Nature presents to it, kind of stuff. And there's no tow trucks or sweeping of the highways in space. So that's really what is contributing, is that the orbital carrying capacity of any given one of these highways is becoming more and more saturated.
I would definitely say that the private space industry as well is kind of accelerating the rate that we can launch, which is obviously great in a lot of reasons and not so great in some others, especially with new programs, constellation programs like Starlink and such. What are your thoughts of how close we're getting to a point where LEO orbits or stuff like that is getting almost too filled up with space junk?
Well, I think the problem is less about the number of objects and more about the uncertainty with understanding where they're at, where they will be, and how to come up with a common set of practices to minimize misinterpretations and bumping into each other and that sort of thing. Space is accessible by pretty much any country. Any country's free to launch whatever they want, as long as they don't incur in what's called harmful interference, whatever that means. And so the number of participants, especially in low Earth orbit, is increasing, but there's no coordination amongst them about when to move and how to move. Everybody's just making whatever decisions that they want or that they feel is best for them, in the absence of knowing the decision-making criteria of others. And that's just a really bad recipe long-term. So, some people are like, oh, sounds like maybe you don't like Elon and SpaceX and the Starlinks and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, I don't take issue with, more objects in space. The manner in which we do it matters. And so that's where I think we need to revisit, have inclusive dialogues, manage that finite resource more holistically. And I think then things could be better. But in our current way of doing things, it's definitely going to end up in a tragedy of the commons. If we do nothing different, we will get to the point where some of these orbital regimes will become unusable, for sure.
I know NASA and SpaceX, actually, I believe just a couple of days ago, signed an agreement to help track their Starlink satellites. How important do you think contracts like that are, and especially moving forward as we get more constellation programs and more satellites?
Yeah, so really what the agreement is that NASA is going to tell SpaceX, here's where our stuff is, and this is where it'll be. And SpaceX has agreed to just move out of the way. That's a step in the right direction. It's not good enough, because the transparency has to be shared. So NASA being transparent with, here are the timetables where I'm going to be out in space, so you can know where I'm going to be at. SpaceX and other entities should do the same thing. Like, everybody should be contributing to transparency and predictability. It's like, this is where I'm going to be at over the next few hours, days, or even weeks. Like, everybody should work towards that and let others know about that, so that the decisions can be kind of shared across the landscape. And so, it's a good first step, but it's not good enough.
So sort of to your earlier point, you were kind of talking about, you alluded to the SpaceX and Elon Musk fan base. I'm curious why you think like these new age of space creates these fan bases that like idolize these different companies and like see that they can do no wrong. Like, what do you think leads to that, and how do we sort of control that?
I think it's just fanaticism in general, man. And the thing is, the space community is not a stranger to fanaticism. We kind of idolize astronauts. We have all sorts of groupies when it comes to this. And so basically, space is the thing that's accessible to people that go through this really grueling process to become a NASA astronaut, or folks that are loaded with cash that can just like buy a trip on Soyuz, and now with the Starlinks through Axiom and that sort of stuff. And so we when we go to space conferences, these are the people that are taking the pictures on the red carpet and blah blah blah, and it just kind of feeds into itself, right? And there's this kind of elitism of, oh, you don't have a PhD, you're just not smart enough to understand, you're just not good enough to blah blah blah, you're just not, and that's no good. And so my thing is, look, we don't worship people that steer boats on the oceans. We don't worship airline pilots and that sort of stuff. We shouldn't be worshiping people just in general. That's just not a good path for humanity. And so space, it's actually where we come from. We come from stardust. Space is a common heritage of humanity. We should be looking at space as just a normal place to do business and extension of human activity. Just like, again, we do things on the land, air, sea. Space is just another domain where human activity can basically evolve. And we should have inclusive dialogues and just let humanity know, yeah, you're all smart enough to get it. There's no reason why it's that complicated, and you should all have a voice in how things happen and where things go, when it comes to space exploration. One of the things, when I talk to companies and I ask them, why aren't you taking into account the voices of other people, is because it's not legal. It's not part of the regulatory process, right? We don't tell people, okay, before you launch your satellite or whatever, in order for you to get licensed, you should have a roundtable, something that's open to the public, for the public to hear what your plans are and for them to provide input. I don't think that is a stretch, or that would be that difficult. But for whatever reason, governments don't want to do that because, we don't want to discourage commerce and all this other stuff. It's like, look, man, I'm not saying that SpaceX should be grounded unless a group of people in northern Idaho says, yes, you can launch your satellite. No, but what I'm saying is, like, give people an opportunity to understand, okay, you want to give them internet and all this technology, at what's the consequence? What's the cost? Be honest with the possible pros and cons of this sort of thing. Let me tell you how I feel about what it is that you're going to do, and then make decisions on how to move forward, right? But it's not having the inclusive dialogue isn't to constrain or limit. It's to actually enroll humanity in a common vision. Because when things happen, when there's agreement, maybe not consensus, but at least some agreement, and people are heard, the outcome tends to be better.
Yeah, I think that brings me to my next question. On your most recent Vox Populi, you had sort of this roundtable of different religious leaders, and that was like a super interesting perspective to hear. I never heard that before. And something that stood out to me was at the beginning, I believe it was Mr. Harrell. He said that he was like super happy to hear that basically everybody was on the same page and everyone had a very similar outlook and just wanted the same things. So that just really resonated with what you were just saying. Like, they just want to understand what's going on, and at the end they just want like peace and respect.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So along those same lines, are there current guidelines and like mitigation techniques? And if so, why aren't they working, and how do we better enforce those?
Yeah, so I would say, much like the pandemic and the spreading of COVID, there you could see the space garbage as also kind of spreading and increasing. And we want to flatten the curve on the growth of that anthropogenic space object population. And the main reason why we can't flatten the curve is because people are non-compliant with these guidelines. So then the question is, okay, so you said, like, why? Well, for one, these guidelines they're not a legal basis. So they're not space law, they're recommendations. So I think what the UN would certainly like to see is, given that over 90 countries by consensus said yes to at least this set of guidelines, 21 of them, each nation state that signed on to that should move to make that their own law. There isn't going to be at least not in the near future, an international governance that is going to enforce space laws. That's probably not going to happen. The quickest path is for the countries, the nation states that are participating in space. If you are agreed to these sorts of things, then, make that legal in your own country, and then monitor, verify, assess, and enforce, within your own legal frameworks. And if everybody does that, then we can start flattening the curve on the growth of space debris. So I think that's really what needs to happen.
So it's interesting because I don't think I've ever heard you say that we need to like stop sending things to space or stop going to space. So I'm curious for you, like, why do you think it's important for humans to go to space?
I would say this: our technology that we depend upon, more and more every day, is greatly enhanced through a lot of space-based assets, internet, financial transactions, all this stuff. And eventually we need to have fully autonomous systems. It's like, not to scare anybody with the whole Terminator thing, but we need the Skynet of autonomous space systems that can do stuff. Beyond that, I would say that humanity as a species, even if we become really good custodians and stewards of life on Earth, we have an expiration date if we don't leave the planet. So if we stay here, there's definitely an expiration date. Our life here is finite for a variety of reasons. One of which is that, population growth and these sorts of things, scarcity of resources. So we need to learn how to be able to thrive elsewhere in the universe. That is a requirement if our species is to extend the expiration date. So we should do that, but the manner in which we do the exploration, I think, needs to change, because right now, look, there's just a lot of negativity, and I try to be fairly optimistic. And at the same time, it's like, I just look at, over the population of the world, how much crap is going on just simply because we don't believe the same things, cultural differences, skin colors different, these sorts of things, right? It's like, it's horrible what we do to each other because of the differences that otherwise we should be celebrating. We're castigating other people because of the differences. It's horrible. And the thing is, chances are, if we don't come to some resolution on that sort of behavior, that's what we carry elsewhere in the universe. And so one of the things that I tell people is, I say, yeah, Mars, I'm going to say something else controversial here, right? It's like, if there's a way to terraform Mars, I'm all for it. Some people are like, oh, well, we need to keep the universe like pristine. There's no reason for that in my mind. It's like, if we want to thrive, terraforming Mars would be a way for us to thrive on Mars, versus living in these bubbles and all this other stuff, which would make things very complicated. And so imagine humanity seeding life on Mars, if we could, and eventually, because it's a different place, different radiation from the sun, different gravity, like all this other stuff. One of the things that Mother Nature does is it evolves. Take something, supplant it, put it somewhere else. If it thrives, it's going to evolve to thrive there. We are perfect for Earth. Our bodies are perfect for Earth. Earth has 3/4 water. Our bodies are like 3/4 water. We have this moon that is in a tidal lock, and it governs like, biological, cycles for women, all this other stuff. Put us on Mars, we're going to have to evolve on Mars. Eventually, humans on Mars are going to look different than humans on Earth. That's going to be the next enemy. I can see it play out already. We need to do something about those people with the larger heads and the blah, 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 and this and that. It's like, I already see that happening, right? So yes, we need to explore the universe. We need to find ways to thrive elsewhere in the universe, but we need to change, evolve our way of relating to each other and treating each other if we want that experiment to actually be fruitful in the end, I think.
It's interesting because for the most part, I've always seen space as like a uniting place. I mean, during the space race, obviously we were very separated, but that led into like the Apollo-Soyuz missions, and then the ISS, which is like the biggest international collaboration in history. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. So here on Earth, it's relatively easy to get people to care about maintaining and respecting the planet since we all live here. But since space feels like so distant to a lot of people, how do you get people to care about keeping Leo clean, keeping space in general clean?
It's a challenge. I'm trying to make the case that near Earth space is one of Earth's lost ecosystems. So it's like, look, there's land, there's air, there's sea, and there's near Earth space. I'm trying to show people analogies between pollution and environmental impact on these other ecosystems and how we see similar stuff in near Earth space. So I'm trying to make those ties and using kind of the same sorts of words and terms to make those linkages. And I'm hoping that more and more people can embrace that. So yeah, it's very difficult. We have a project called Eyes on the Sky, which is a UT project, eyesonthesky.org. We actually have a horn raiser to try to develop a mixed reality experience that precisely says, here we go, indigenous people learned how to achieve balance with nature through traditional ecological knowledge over millennia, blah, blah, blah. Here are some environmental impacts in land, air, and sea that they've been able to kind of overcome to some extent. We can apply these tenets of traditional ecological knowledge to near Earth space. And here's the linkages. Embrace this extra ecosystem, which is near Earth space. But yeah, it's very challenging.
Do you think, so we're going to transition to astrograph. And when I pulled that up, like, it was very startling. Visualization is like a pretty powerful thing, I think. When I first saw all those dots, I was just like, whoa, like, I can definitely see this as an issue. So what was your goal with astrograph, and kind of what was the inspiration, and how is it evolving?
Yeah, so, astrograph is meant to be kind of this crowdsourced, heterogeneous database of stuff in space. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and I realized this when I worked for the Air Force Research Lab, is that there's definitely biases and prejudices related to space activities, who's doing what to whom when, he said, she says, and that sort of stuff, saber rattling. And much like we have an app called Waze for traffic, that's a participatory sensing application where the people using the app actually have an ability to input information and data, and somehow this crowdsourced information can be made to be useful to the people that actually use the app, right? There's something on the side of the road, watch out, there's a cop behind this tree, blah, blah, blah. So the reason for astrograph is to make space more transparent, make space more predictable, and develop a body of evidence that could be used to hold people accountable for their behaviors, and get around the possibility of any single entity uniquely biasing or prejudicing our opinions about stuff in space.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about tracking space junk, but there have also been a number of proposals in terms of actually deorbiting some of these defunct satellites and fragments. Whether it be net, grabbing arm, there's been a lot of different solutions proposed out there. What are your thoughts on some of these and kind of the feasibility aspect of them?
Yeah, so I think that part of the solution, aside from incentivizing compliance, is to remove some of these things. There are some super spreader events in space and I call the super spreader events these like massive objects, derelict, rocket bodies that are pretty much ticking time bombs. When these things explode, they'll create hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris. When something collides with them, they'll also create many, many more objects. So I would say the easiest thing that you don't even have to think about, the no-brainer, is to remove these super spreader events. Beyond that, I think I'm all for, just like we talk about minimizing single-use plastics on the Earth, I'm all for minimizing single-use satellites. So can we design satellites so that they can be recycled, repurposed, these sorts of things? So for sure, on-orbit servicing and that is needed. And yes, there will be some satellites that will need to be removed by something like Astroscale or some other of these companies to basically provide capacity back to that orbital neighborhood. So one of the things that I mentioned this idea of orbital carrying capacity. We see carrying capacity in ecosystems. When that gets saturated, there's only so many people that can live in this area, and above that, then bad things start to happen, famine and disease and sickness. There's also, carrying capacity for highways. So we can take that concept and apply it to near Earth space and say, let's quantify the carrying capacity of any given one of these orbital highways. And so when that capacity is being taken or even saturated, we need to do something to actively provide that capacity back so that other people can actually use it. And I think this is where it'll make sense to have a space debris removal, type of activity.
You talked about these super spreader events. Could you describe what the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite test was, and kind of like why that was such a big deal and harmful to space junk and LEO orbit in general?
Yeah, so this Fengyun 1C satellite belonging to China was in one of these sun synchronous orbits, kind of high altitude, sufficiently high to where basically blowing this thing up into many, many thousands of pieces meant that most of that cloud of shrapnel and trash stays up there for a very, very long time, decades to centuries sort of thing. And so that's really the bad news, is that because it was sufficiently high, a lot of that stuff is going to be up there for a very long time, and now is a hazard to other things that are working and are providing services. And I think the really bad news about space debris is that when it's created, most of the stuff created is untrackable because it's too small, but has a lot of kinetic energy, just like bullets are small, but can do a lot of damage because of the kinetic energy. So it's not so much for the things that we can track, but it's mostly for the stuff that's untrackable that are now adding to the random bullets that we have to rely on the strategy of hope that it doesn't collide with something that we care about.
Mm-hmm. The Kessler effect was kind of famously depicted in the movie Gravity. I was wondering if you could kind of describe how close we are like that, and just kind of describe what the Kessler effect is in general as well.
Yeah, so look, I think Don Kessler, he may have been a bit misinterpreted with his whole kind of theory, but in general, it's this idea that when you have all of these anthropogenic objects in the same kind of orbital regime, and these things are colliding with each other from time to time, there comes a point when even if you don't launch and add any more objects, there is a cascading effect where the population will grow on its own due to all these inter-object collisions and stuff. And so it's this kind of this runaway train kind of process of collisions forever until like space becomes unusable. I don't subscribe to that concept because in my experience as a scientist, anytime that we remove exogenous input into a system, the system seeks an equilibrium state. So as soon as you stop inputting stuff and leave things alone, Mother Nature seeks equilibrium states. And I think it's the same thing for space. Now, by launching, satellites every few weeks, we don't allow Mother Nature to give us an indication on what equilibrium might mean. But if we stopped launching, look, with COVID, right? It's like one of the first things that people saw with COVID is, oh, animals are coming back out again, and they weren't. Oh, now we can go to Venice and like see to the bottom of the canals when we couldn't before because we were churning stuff up with activity. Same thing in space. I don't believe that there's going to be this runaway cascading thing because look, at some point, objects are in relative orbits that have little kind of relative velocity with each other. So to think that this thing is just going to be collisions in perpetuity, that doesn't make sense either. And sometimes when things are small enough, they might get perturbed by non-gravitational influences that might actually help clean or remove or whatever. So I think that if we stop launching things, yes, we will achieve equilibrium states. That said, what I do believe in as an alternative to the Kessler thing is that orbital carrying capacities can get saturated. That's a problem. So we can have areas of space that become unusable because of a combination of number of objects and the uncertainty with which we understand can predict where these things are going to be at any given point in time.
I have sort of a random question. You've said that you wanted to see UT turn into Hogwarts. Can you kind of explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've seen in my own research is that wicked problems like what we're facing in space that they're very complex. Space is a complex system. We have causal relationships that we don't understand. It can be very nonlinear. A very small cause now can have a huge consequence in the near future. The behavior that we see in near Earth space isn't just explained by adding behaviors of things that we do kind of see, so on and so forth. These problems aren't solved by just aerospace engineers, right? It takes somebody that knows astrodynamics. It takes somebody that is a space physicist that understands space weather phenomena. It takes somebody who's a space policy lawyer. It takes all these different disciplines, but not each one individually, but the fusion of these disciplines. And so this is what is referred to as transdisciplinarity, basically reaching across boundaries to where the solution is a fusion of all of these disciplines. And I think that, and I see more transdisciplinarians coming through my classrooms, in that some of my students are like, I don't want to just learn about orbits. I also want to get like an education in public policy and government. And I want to, because they realize that they need to be at the nexus of these things, right? That's where transdisciplinarity lives. I believe to that effect that we do not have nowhere on planet Earth is there an institution of higher education that embraces and that actively seeks to grow transdisciplinarity, and for sure not for space. And so the idea of the Hogwarts for space is, let people be Gryffindor, Slytherin, Hufflepuff, all this other stuff, but everybody takes the whole protection against the dark arts class together. And so that way the person at LBJ gets some idea of how difficult it is to track objects in space and the growth of the debris, blah, blah, blah. But then it's like the aerospace engineer that is focused on astrodynamics realizes that, hey, it's not just because I have a scientific thing to present, like we have to build consensus and people have to be enrolled in the vision. And so that only comes through having classes that are shared across these disciplines. And I think that UT could be the Hogwarts for space in that regard, if enough people believed in that vision.
Makes sense. So you also often say that people are going to do what's legal, not what's right at the end of the day. So that kind of implies that the government has to be at the forefront of this change. How do you see, what does that path look like for government change? Does that start at science communication and educating the public to change the government, or is it the other way around? What does that look like?
I think it's what you just said. I think it's science communication, educating the public, and then public can then put pressure on government to move in this direction. It doesn't come from me just talking to staffers on the Hill and that sort of stuff. That's not what's going to make it happen. It has to be through public pressure and making it very apparent. Hey, here's how people are behaving. Here's the evidence. Here's the consequences. Change is needed.
Interesting. And then can you talk a little bit more about your role? Let me pull up the title again here. At the Robert Strauss Center for the Security and Law, you were kind of referring it to earlier about becoming the Hogwarts and having that law aspect. What is your role there, and what's happening at UT?
Yeah, so within the Strauss Center, the program is focused on space security and safety. One of the things that we're doing under the program, aside from having Brumley fellows and scholars a part of it, and some non-resident fellows to give classes, Professor Diane Howard right now is giving a class where engineers and LBJ students and law students can see this idea of, again, the nexus of science and policy coming together. So we're already doing those sorts of things. There's a set of videos to educate the public that we've already made very available on the website there. And so the goal is to use that space security and safety program as an impetus to then reach out to other parts of campus to try to develop this kind of transdisciplinary educational curriculum.
Very cool. And then another one of my favorite quotes from researching you is you said, for people who think that the earth is flat, I can't even begin to have that conversation with you. How do you think that these ideas and like these different conspiracies like come to prevalence, and how do we prevent that?
One of the things that So one of the things that I've been noticing is that there's a significant movement of anti-intellectualism. And I think part of it is, the fault, the mea culpa of folks within the space industry for being very elitist and that sort of thing. So I think the way to start getting around this is to be very honest with the science and not assume that the public can't get it. Let me give you an example of, and this is a sad example to me, right? Is having NASA astronauts talk about zero gravity or microgravity. There is no such thing, man, about zero gravity. It's like the acceleration due to gravity at the space station is like 90% what the acceleration due to gravity is on the Earth's surface. There's lots of gravity. And what I tell people is, here's the deal. You have a tennis ball with a string and you spin that tennis ball around. You know what gravity is? The string. If there was zero gravity, cut the string, what happens to the tennis ball? Keeps on going in a straight line. I don't know. Newton talked about this sort of stuff. Einstein basically made it into a curvature of space-time. We can have honest conversations with the public about this, but trying to protect the public, protecting the stupid people by telling them that there's zero gravity is to the detriment of humanity, I think. And I gotta be honest, when I talk to kids in elementary school and I tell them about, people at the space station, blah, 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 and they all say zero gravity, it's like they don't get the physics because that's not the right physics. But once I explain to them, things are in this constant state of free fall. It's like you're always falling, but you're moving so fast that you're always missing. And there's this aha moment. And then there's the ability, because they have the right physics, they can connect other things. So I think, look, we don't need to be limiting or lying to people or trying to dumb stuff down for people and be pejorative in this way. It's like, we just need to be honest and just find better ways of communicating and making analogies and that sort of stuff. But I think one of the best things NASA could do is say, you know what, we've been saying zero gravity for a while, and even microgravity, that's kind of a misnomer. Here's what's really happening. But NASA won't do it because then it's like admitting that they've made a mistake, right?
Interesting. All right, so we have a couple of questions from a couple of members. Some of them are pretty similar to what we've gone over, but the first question has to do with like economies of scale of deorbiting and maintaining. It's interesting because like as we launch more and more, it'll get cheaper to do so, but there'll also be more things. So the question is kind of wondering about economies of scale and like, does it make sense to maybe tax a customer at the beginning of a launch to pay for a deorbit, or I don't know, maybe just talk a little bit more about like on orbit maintenance and different solutions like that.
So I think, look, if we can do the following things, if we can globally accept that near Earth space is an ecosystem, and as such is also a finite resource, and as such is in need of environmental protection, then we can agree on having these sustainability metrics like a space traffic footprint. That's like a carbon footprint analog. It would be some composite index that would basically capture the burden that any given object, dead or alive, poses on anything else. And then we can also agree to a definition of the orbital carrying capacity. And much like the ITU allocates spectrum to anybody who wants to launch, we could have maybe the something under the UN perhaps allocate orbital carrying capacity to anybody who wants to launch. And so Once we can start assigning a space traffic footprint to everything, we can then understand, oh, these are the objects that are taking up capacity. Then we can go to the people that are liable for that object, because under the UN Convention on Liability and Damage, every object up there, depending on where it originated from and who the launch states are associated with that object. And launch state is defined as any nation state that launches an object, procures a launch of an object, or from whose territory or facility an object is launched. So some objects, maybe like one of Planet Labs satellites launched by India, means that the US government and the Indian government have joint liability over any of Planet's type stuff. So those are the people that have the responsibility. It's governments at the end of the day. And so once we have these sustainability metrics, then we can make that very publicly known. And then we can go to the governments and say, hey, your objects that are dead are taking up 90% of the carrying capacity of this orbit, which prevents other countries to actually make use of it for their own purposes and all this other stuff. So what are you going to do about it? Are you going to remove it? And if you're not going to remove it, maybe we should lean on things like salvage laws from the ocean and basically say, we're going to actually pay somebody to remove it, but then there's a consequence to the government that failed to remove the object, for instance. I think those scenarios make a lot of sense only in the presence of these sustainability metrics.
So as I said, we were doing all we could to research you, and it was nearly impossible since you do so much. It seems like you're on a new podcast, or you give a new lecture almost every day. So more of a personal question, how do you stay organized? And do you have like a daily routine? I know you run a lot.
Yeah, so the running is something that I do to help manage my stress and anxiety. I suffer from anxiety, and for a number of years, I'd have like panic attacks and that sort of stuff. And so the running really helps me with that. And so I try to run a 5K every day. So that's what I try to do to kind of keep that going. Yep. I've changed what I eat and that sort of stuff to help me manage that. So that helps. And then when it comes to what I do and that sort of thing, I'm not that organized. I wish and several people have said, look, maybe you should try to hire like a student that could help kind of manage this stuff for you. So I'm putting this out there that I may be looking for somebody like that, because in my life, I see myself surrounded by conveyor belts. When I was an undergrad, I used to work at UPS. And so it's like, taking boxes off conveyor belts and stuff. So it's like, I feel that there are many conveyor belts with stuff coming my way. And I look at the boxes, and most of the time I just take a box and I kick it back up. And I just try to what's the thing that's screaming at me the loudest, that has the biggest impact or begging most of my attention, or that if I don't do it, I'm going to suffer the biggest embarrassment. And I feel on a daily basis, to be quite honestly, to be very candid with you, I feel that the decisions that I make on a daily basis for what I do is kind of like balancing who am I going to disappoint the most today, and trying to figure that out and send my I'm sorries. So yeah, I have that level of involvement and kind of saturation every day with emails and all this other stuff that's my current form of existence. So it's not something I would recommend to people. But one of the things that comes to my mind is many, many, many years ago, somebody told me, and I really believe in this, is they said, look, if you want something done and done well, find the busiest person and make them do it. There's truth to that.
Oh, okay. Are you a big soccer fan?
I am.
Are you excited about
Austin FC?
I am. Yeah. So, I got my first vaccine, hopefully the next one soon. I miss soccer. I am very excited to be able to like go and watch games live and that sort of stuff. So yeah, absolutely. It's like I'm so happy that Austin has its own football club.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are they starting already, or is that in a month?
Yeah. They've actually got like, I think a game with LA Galaxy is like sometime in April and that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Coming up.
Okay, we had one more question just sneak in from DT Ranjit, who's on our team. He's asking if like reusable spacecraft, like what SpaceX is doing, is that enough to mitigate and control the debris, or are we going to have to take like deorbiting measures? Is it enough to just start now, or do we have to go fix what we've done?
I think the solution I tend to think is always hybrid. And so we're going to have to do a all hands on deck, all the above. So part of it is reusable, but then the other part is there's going to be a subset of things that aren't. And so we're going to have to remove those back to the, minimizing space traffic footprints, providing capacity back to certain orbits. So yeah, we're going to need a little bit of all those things.
Cool.
I have another question as well related to that. So the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel recently put out their 2020 report. And in that, they talk specifically about space junk for a good amount. And one of their first recommendation for Congress actually was to appoint a lead federal agency to have a space traffic management system. Do you think, just specifically within the U.S., there's a best agency, whether that be Space Force, NASA, or something like that? Who do you think would be best for that role?
I just think that, look, Space Policy Directive number 3 was signed by the last administration on June 18th of 2018, and it said, make the Office of Space Commerce lead that. Just do that. We had $500,000 was given to the National Academy of Public Administration to do an independent study to figure out what would be a suitable agency to do this. And they come back with, Office of Space Commerce. So it's like, we suffer every day that we haven't just pulled the lever and made that happen. Is there any agency that could fully own the problem? No. And I've told people it should be managed like a matrix organization. When I was at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, which is a matrix organization, I had 2 bosses. I had a program manager and I had a line manager. My line manager, I was in the group of interplanet spacecraft navigators. So I and about a dozen other people were all spacecraft nav people. But then there was a project manager, like, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, that would say, hey, I need to have, 3 nav people. And then that manager would talk to the line manager and they'd negotiate something. Okay, you're going to get 1.5, full-time equivalents of nav here and blah, blah, blah. And so that's the way it was done. When it comes to space traffic management, let Office of Space Commerce be the program manager, but the line elements need to be all the other areas where skill set is needed to make it close. So interagency, NASA should be a line element. The Department of Defense should be a line element. The FAA should be a line element, the FCC, and so on and so forth. So let Commerce be the program manager, but basically go to all these line elements to pull in the expertise and the resources and all that stuff so that it's an interagency matrix type organization. That's the only way this is going to work. Trying to find the one ring to rule them all, like that only works in the movies, man.
Awesome. Well, I know we're almost out of time. Do you want to let people know where they can find you and what you got coming up?
Yeah, so I would say most of the stuff about me is on like flow.page/Moriba. So you can find, CV, slides on my research program, all that stuff. And in terms of what I'm doing, that's hard to say. I'm involved in so many things, United Nations, NATO, all this stuff. So just kind of keep up with me on social media and you'll pretty much see what I'm up to. I will say that I have the next Space Cafe, Moriba's Vox Populi. That's going to be on April 8th. These things always happen on a Thursday at 4 p.m. Central European time. Keep that in mind. And the next one is going to be about space security and the saber rattling on orbit, and how can we put together practices that could basically mitigate misconceptions on orbit and try to de-escalate what could otherwise lead to conflicts. And so it's free. Moriba's Vox Populi, sign up, and then we could have a candid conversation about this stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd say the
Looking
best
forward to
place to keep up with you is LinkedIn. You're pretty active there. And
Yeah.
the best place, if you want to feel lazy, is follow you on Instagram.
There you go.
You post all your running there, and it makes me feel bad. But yeah, well, thank you so much for your time.
for doing this. I definitely want to say, when we first were talking about getting this podcast together and who would be good guests, I think you were definitely within the first 3 names that came up, and being definitely like a wish list there. So it means a lot that you were able to stop by.
Oh, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And we need to, we're in this together, so.